Well, welcome to our video of Christianity. I am Doug Beatty, professor of New Testament Studies, professor for comparative world religion for this class, and also for ethics at LCC, and working on a survey of the Old Testament. Christianity, it's a historical religion. It's founded not on abstract principles, but on concrete events, actually historical. The most important of these is the life of a Jewish carpenter. That's by Houston Smith, who wrote one of the early textbooks for world religions, having lived and grew up as a missionary in Asia, in the China area. But that's his view of what Christianity is. It's definitely based on some history, and we're going to look at that. Christianity, of all the great religions, is very widespread. It's the largest number of adherents, as you can see in this pie graph here, 31%, about 8% less are Muslims. And then unclassified would include the atheists, agnostics, there's Hindus, and then about half of that are Buddhists. Most of India are Hindu. And percentages are a little challenging when it comes to world population. To be honest, a lot of people say, well, they're Christian just because they live in America. Some people say, oh yeah, they're a Hindu just because they live in India, or that they're a Buddhist just because they live in China, or they're a Muslim just because they live in Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Middle East. So it's a little challenging, but this is what we got, and we're going to go with it. The life and teachings of Jesus are found in the New Testament, is what is called, of what's called the whole of the Holy Bible. Christianity is really coming out of Judaism, and the main person and factor is Jesus. His apostles help him out. He recruits 12 men, and we read about them in the New Testament, namely the four biographies of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as they're abbreviated here. The book of Acts is about a 30-year travel from Jesus' ascension to Paul's imprisonment. There's a lot of political aspects going on, and mostly it's because of the Jewish background and the Jewish religious leadership interacting with Jesus early on, and then with the apostles in the book of Acts, and of course with others as we get hints of throughout the New Testament. Geographically, it's pretty local, and that is it's in one area, Israel. Now, the New Testament, which means a contract or a covenant, that's what that testament is about. It's not just a testimony, but it's a covenant made by Jesus with the Gospels. The synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So remember that, the synoptics. John is a little bit different. And Jesus' life spanned from basically 4 BC to 30 AD, in that neighborhood. He ascended into heaven just 40 days after his resurrection. And then on the 50th day, the day of Pentecost, in Acts chapter 2, is where we see the Spirit coming down on his apostles and other people, and the church really began. But at any rate, the book of Acts spans a pretty lengthy span of history. And the apostles then, there are 12 of them as they are listed here. There are 2 Judases, and there are 2 Simons, and then there is James, 2 Jameses, and then there was another guy outside of these 2 named James, the brother of Jesus. And there was another Judas named Jude, brother of Jesus, that both became followers of him after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. But then there's Paul's epistles. He wrote 13 of them. I don't think Hebrews was one of Paul's writings. Some would include that. A lot of people are uncertain. But that's why there's 13 or maybe 14 if the book of Hebrews is included. And if it's not, then it's part of the 8 of the general epistles, or 7 if you recognize him as a separate from the writings of Paul. Revelation, and it's in parentheses called the Apocalypse, because that's what Revelation is translated from in Greek. The very first word in the book of Revelation, I want to point out, it's not Revelations, it's Revelation. The very first word in the book is Apocalypse. And that is just a transliteration. That's the way it's pronounced in Greek. That's what it is in English, Apocalypse. And it means revealed. It means kind of a presented or opened up. It's a revelation of all the visions that John the Apostle had on the island of Patmos. So that's the New Testament covenant, if you will, with his followers with God. The geography, as you can see, is just again in Israel. Point out again, here is the West Bank. This is Palestine today. They don't get a vote on how their politics works. A lot of people in Palestine don't ever get to leave Palestine, ever. The same goes with the Golan Heights people that live there, and then the Gaza Strip. Those are all Palestinian groups that live here. They don't get a vote of Israel's politics or any say on how money is spent. They're just recipients of however the politics happen in Jerusalem. And there's certain reasons for that, none of which we're going to get into. But this just gives you an idea of the modern day Israel from it's called Dan to Beersheba. That's what some of the Old Testament descriptions of this whole place is. This is called the Jordan River and the Jordanian Rift, some might call it in here, and it's all below sea level. But we'll look at that. I took a trip to Israel, and we are on the backside of Nineveh. Walking north and northwest, and we're going to a little place here called Sepphoris. Zippori is, if any of you knew your Old Testament history, is the wife of Moses. But Sepphoris is right here, and it's a little white spot at the top of the mound. We're walking from here. It's about 4 miles, and this is the rocky arena, excuse me, that is all throughout Israel. And then we walked another time to the Horns of Atene, and these are 2 volcanoes that are no longer active. And this is the road that we walked down, right down here, and we turned around. And along this road, I took a picture of that, and the Horns of Atene are over here around this road. This road here is the extension of this one, or the beginning of this one extends of that one. The main reason I have this picture up is this. This is Mount Hermon, or Mount Hermon, in Lebanon. It's about 40 miles to the north of us, and it was on one of the most clear days we could see it. It's just amazing. Beautifully clear. That gives you another idea of some of the topography that you find in Israel. It's not like Kansas. It is not flat. Okay, we're on the top of the Horns of Atene, and you can see the Sea of Galilee in the background here. This is Sea of Galilee around this stretch of Mount Arbel, and we walk the next day down this road and all the way up. This is quite a traverse up, and then we go on the edge and see along here some cliffs. This is a national park. We're on a national park in Israel here. This is a national park and where Herod the Great, around anywhere from 10 to maybe 5 BC, he had a lot of Jews thrown off the edge there because they were just not cooperating with the political business of the day. They were hiding, and he had them thrown. But at any rate, this is where some of the places we walked in. Possibly Jesus walked here, or Abraham, or any other biblical character. Here's another map, just specifically of Sea of Galilee, and where we are just had that picture is basically right here looking over Mount Arbel and down into the Sea of Galilee here. Even though Hattin is there, well, I guess there's the horns of Hattin, but we were looking about here and looking over. And then we walked down to Tadga and Capernaum, where Jesus, Jesus did a lot of his work around Capernaum, and that was kind of his home base for the New Testament, at least in the Gospels. That's where Jesus made his home a good share of the time. And to help you understand the size of the Sea of Galilee, beside it being 700 feet below sea level already, this is 12 miles from the south to the north, and it's 6 miles basically from west to east, and that's the size of the sea. As we were walking at one point down the valley of Arbel, we landed across an olive tree, and you can see the branches are cut pretty thin. The point is, olives don't grow off of old branches. They only grow off of new ones. So you want to trim back a tree if you want olives. And this particular tree is probably the oldest one we saw, and they estimate it about 2,000 years old. It was probably planted by the Romans after they invaded Israel and took over at one point there. Who knows when exactly. They didn't leave a tag. But nonetheless, this is a friend of mine. Went to a graduate school together, and he's leading a tour through Israel about twice a year, and I was able to go with him. During that trip on a Sunday morning, we found a local Bedouin shepherd, and he has a sheep, and Mark talked to him, and we're in a national park area, so we weren't traversing over any private property, but he was just leading his sheep and having them graze. And that's what the green pastures of Israel may look like today. As we continued to traverse, you can see the rocky road and the rocks just around the hills and everything. This was during the time of their winter and showery months. Wet time for them is winter, and we were there in the first week of January. While we were there, we looked up at one point. We see a herd of deer running, and I got a picture of its one of the hoofs, and I just thought it was interesting. I tried to make it where you could see the deer here in the picture of the rocks to the left, but it's not very visible. But maybe you can imagine some deer here looking down at us while they're running away and walking up to the top of the hill. As the time went on through that trip, I went to the Western Wall. This is in Jerusalem. This is at the base of where the Temple Mount is, and it's divided here with a wall here, a fence, and then a little wall here. This is the women's area, and then they can go around at this edge over here and pray, and then the men can walk down this path around this side of the wall and pray along this wall. This is a wash basin, which you're supposed to be clean, and then they have double handles on all the cups. That's the proper way to wash, and this guy is washing properly before he prays and going down the wall. And I did that too, and it was very interesting. But this wall, what's interesting to me, the most interesting part of this is that this would have been here during the time of Jesus. The very same bricks, very same rocks. And one of these, they estimate, it might be this one here, they estimate it to weigh about 150 tons. Pretty big rock. Well, the Western Wall is on this side of the Temple Mount. This would be the Temple Mount here and the Dome of the Rock here. We're on the Mount of Olives overlooking some burial grounds. And we're going to walk to the right here and then walk down this valley back and forth through some olive trees and olive groves, and then go into Jerusalem, Old Jerusalem right here at one of the points of entry there. Then the old city, it's surrounded by a wall. And as we went through the Lion's Gate, and many think that's where Stephen was stoned in Acts chapter 7. The geography of Jesus isn't just around Jerusalem or Israel. I mean, the geography of the New Testament. The geography of Jesus is he never really left. During his ministry time, he was in this area the whole time and never really went outside those bounds. Of course, he was in Egypt as a child for a time, but when he did his ministry, they pretty much right there. But Paul and other of the ministers and as missionaries traversed here, and Paul went about this far and maybe on over to Rome during his stay in during some of his writings in the New Testament. I would like to point out you're also seeing Crete. This is mentioned in the New Testament. It's an island. All of the islands here are Greek. Any island in the Aegean Sea is a particular color. Are considered Grecian islands. So Turkey here does not get any of the islands. Patmos is right here. This is where John the Apostle had the visions in the book of Revelation for that book. Rome came in charge about 37 BCE. They added Judea. That's the area of Israel of the day today. And during that time, Augustus wasn't, he was not a Caesar, but during the time of the New Testament, we have three Caesars mentioned in the New Testament: Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius. Caligula was not, Nero was not. He was the one was really against Christians, and Vespasian and Titus, they were later. But nonetheless, Jesus was a Jew, and the religious Jews at the time really worked hard against him, and they were trying to figure him out. Herod the Great was the leader of the Jewish nation, if you will. He was overseeing it. He was considered himself a king, even though Rome wasn't giving him a kingship, but he was the ruler of that area at the time, and he called himself a king, and other people did too. There are 6 Herods mentioned in the New Testament. Starting with him is the one in Matthew chapter 2, where he tried to kill Jesus when they fled, he and his family. Of course, Jesus was just a newborn, and his family were told to Joseph and Mary with Jesus to go to Egypt. Herod then killed the little ones around Bethlehem under the age of 2, and then not very long after that, he died. And but he had 2 sons named Herod, and they named their kids Herod, and they pop up here and there in the New Testament. So it's going to get a little confusing. But Herod the Great and they call him that because he was a great builder. He built Caesarea, and there's a seaport in the Mediterranean Sea that can still be seen today in Caesarea. He built his own palace just outside of and above Bethlehem. Kind of Bethlehem was in its shadow. He rebuilt the temple for the Jews, and to get in their favor, he wanted to do things for them. And it wasn't technically totally done until 67. He was already dead for some 60 years or so. And then just 3 years later than that, it was totally destroyed by the Romans. So, but he was the great builder. And Masada he built, and some other places as well. Some great. He was considered a great builder. There were people of Jewish religious affiliation that were Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zealots. They're all mentioned in the New Testament. The Essenes are not mentioned, but they are given great credit for having stored and maybe hidden some documents that would have been during that time, which would not have been anything New Testament, but the documents would have been the Tanakh, the Old Testament, or the Jewish writings, and other things outside of the Tanakh, besides the Torah, the Nevi'im, or the Ketuvim. The Essenes would have hidden them from the Romans, and they found those in some caves, and they call them, well, the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they were around the Dead Sea. But people were speaking three languages during this time. The Jews spoke Hebrew, or Aramaic, as it would have been called. Everyone spoke Greek, and a lot of people spoke the Roman language, which was kind of new for them, but it was Latin. But Latin kind of overtook Greek about the 3rd, 4th century AD, and then Greek kind of fell out of use, and by probably the 7th century, Greek wasn't used anymore at all, but Latin was. So this was just a perfect time for a New Testament, say, to be written down in Greek. Certainly it was out of Judaism. The Septuagint was an Old Testament, Tanakh again, written in the Greek language so that they could read it, and it wouldn't have to be in Hebrew and people explain who or what they're saying. Some of the political people wanted to know what they were talking about, so they wanted the Jewish literature to be written in Greek. And so they did that. The 70 is the Roman numeral LXX is the Roman numeral for 70, and they claim that there were 70 scribes who translated this text in a fairly short amount of time. It was about 250, 300 BC. During that time, 200-300 years before Christ or so, and it was from Hebrew into Greek. And that is what is quoted a lot in the New Testament. It's, of course, written in Greek, and you can tell it's quoted from the Septuagint translation from Hebrew. And it was also what is used exclusively in the book of Hebrews. It's quotes. It doesn't give any paraphrases, but it only quotes from the Septuagint. But it's very significant because the Septuagint was found in 1948 or so, and in the 50s came to light to scholars, and then they started doing more digging and found more of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's very important because then they can show that, hey, 250 BC, this is what Isaiah said. And the oldest manuscripts we had, say, of Isaiah were only about 1,000 years old from today, from 11th or 12th, maybe 13th century. But to find these, now you back it up to 1,000 years or 1,200 years or more, and you realize, oh, the scriptures that were written in the Tanakh haven't changed. And a lot of people were saying they had in the 50s. So it's very significant to show that, hey, we have some Old Testament documents that show these scriptures have not been morphed, they have not been edited, they have not been changed over a period of 1,000 years. That's pretty significant. And it was a very important discovery for people. And people still rely on the Septuagint for showing what and how they use Greek in some of the older language stuff. It was very important. Hellenism is just the idea that Greek culture influenced everything, and especially the language. And I might add that Greek culture would include some of the mythology about the Greek gods, like Aphrodite and Zeus and other Greek gods you may know of. And then, of course, they have their Roman equivalents. And I don't remember all those things. But Hellenism is the Greek influence, and especially the language. And these three languages, Latin, Greek, and Aramaic, are the three, or Hebrew, this would also be, are the three different languages that Pilate wrote over Jesus on the cross. It said, "Here, the King of the Jews." And They wanted that change, but he put it in all three languages because all kinds of people were walking by and seeing that. And really, the New Testament, and especially Christianity as a whole, Christianity is about Jesus, about what he did, and about his life and his teachings. Christianity is not about the church as you see it in America. Christianity is not about the church by monasteries or by a particular bent of Christianity, Catholics or Protestants or any others. Christianity is about what Jesus taught as the Christ, as the Messiah of the people. The life and teachings of Jesus are found in, as I mentioned, in the New Testament. The birth of Jesus is only found in really two different books. The birth of John the Baptist is only found in one. The birth of John the Baptist is found in Luke, and Luke chapter 1. The birth of Jesus is talked about in Luke chapter 1, but then the event that we often hear, the shepherds watched their field by night, and that's when the angels came and that sort of thing. That's all found in Luke 2. Where Joseph gets involved and then flees to Egypt, that's in Matthew chapter 1 and 2 is where that birth story is talked about, and the wise men that came to give 3 separate gifts. We don't know how many wise men. It could have been 40. It could have been 2. But they gave 3 gifts. There were not ever mentioned in the Bible 3 wise men. But those are the birth stories of those 2 people. And in John chapter 1, the birth story of Jesus basically is just simply put as, and the Word became flesh. And now the Greek word for word is logos. And that's when Jesus' ministry begins. After that, we find it in John and early on in the other Gospels. In Mark 1, it just starts right with that, and with his baptism, and John the Baptist sharing with him, and same with the others. So his teachings begin. When Jesus was teaching about those to follow him, I just want to point out the book doesn't, your textbook doesn't follow this line of thought or talk about it. But first of all, Jesus says, hey, following me is going to be challenging. It's not an easy peasy road. It's not a road that's simple. He said, as it's challenging, it's a thoughtful road. You have to think things through. You have to plan things out and be prepared. And he says it's a relational road. It's about a relationship with Christ and through him with the Father in the end. And this passage is listed here from Matthew 7, is in the Sermon on the Mount, and how Jesus uses this illustration. Hey, just because you called me Lord, Lord, and did a few miracles, you get to heaven and God says, hey, I don't know you. Too bad. You need to know who God is. You need to have a relationship. And then it's also others-oriented. This passage is talking about him being others-oriented, and we're to follow his path, to be concerned about others. Jesus didn't come to be served, but he came to serve, and he says we need to follow him in his path. And the real key verse is Matthew chapter 16 about the following of Jesus. He says, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And what did the cross mean? Well, the cross typically means harsh punishment. The cross was a tough road to bear, shameful. And Jesus talks a lot about that. But at any rate, following Jesus is not easy, and he never promised it. Jesus did proclaim some of his own purposes. And he said he came to fulfill the law and the prophets, not to brush them under the rug. He didn't come to abolish them. He came to fulfill them. He also had the authority to forgive sins, and he came to forgive. Jesus didn't come to bring peace, he said, but to bring a sword. And that is to say between families, not between you and God. He says, I came to seek and save the lost. He was looking to find people that were willing to listen and help the lost. He didn't come to find the people that are already on the right road. I came to give life and life more abundantly, he says. And he said, I came to go and suffer and be betrayed. In all three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we can find this pattern of 3 different times he said this to his followers. They were confused by it. In Matthew chapter 16, I think that probably should be actually, but Matthew 16 is the first time it's mentioned. And Peter heard that and said, no, 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 that's not going to happen to you. And Jesus scolded Peter and said, get thee behind me. You don't have the things of God, but you have the things of men in mind. Jesus' point was to come and suffer, to die for people's sin. And the Son of God, or the Son of Man, didn't come to be served, and that's what the Matthew 20:28 says. Didn't come to serve, to get served, but to serve other people. To be a ransom for many. And so the illustration in the book talks a little bit about the real theme of Christianity is that we have been separated by God by sin, and in order to get back in a good relationship with God, in good graces with God, we have to accept His help. We can't do it alone, and sin is what separates us. Jesus came to take care of that, so we cross the road, if you will. We can cross the great deep chasm between people and God only through Jesus. And God provided the path, and the only way to Him is through Christ. And Jesus even said that in John chapter 14, verse 6. And Jesus paid the price on the cross for our salvation. He was punished. He became sin for the sinners and was punished as if He did all the sin, while He Himself was sinless, according to the teachings of Christianity. Jesus provides us the salvation, and you can say He nailed it. Salvation is really based on the faith that one has in what Christ has done for us in the cross and the whole event of the death, burial, and resurrection. It's really what it's all about. There's some New Testament passages that show the importance of faith. I think these are 5 passages here, very important. And I'm going to just read one of them. I'm going to skip down to Galatians 2:21. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could have been gained through the law, then Christ died for nothing. If we could have gained something by being obedient to all these things, then what did Christ die for? Well, I'll talk a little bit about the reason He died, but all of these are saying the same thing, that faith is of the utmost importance. We have to accept by faith what Christ has done for us, and we become righteousness in God's eyes because of our faith, not because of what we've done. And this is a sticking point between some different groups in Christianity, because some really want to point more to other things. We have to do other stuff. But the scriptures, at least, point to no, all the other stuff is taken care of. We need to have faith in what Christ did for us. Jesus fulfilled the task on the cross, and He said it is finished. On the cross, Jesus revealed the love of God. He gave us our justification and showed forgiveness. He illustrated that on the cross, taught it throughout his whole thing, that we have to forgive. And Jesus even did that while on the cross. He said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Earlier in His teaching, Jesus said, if you don't forgive, God won't forgive you. So could be a real sticking point for some people. But forgiveness was taught on the cross, and it was illustrated on the cross, and we receive forgiveness by through Jesus' death on the cross. He defeated the devil. Atonement was made. God's wrath against sin was totally satisfied. The reason he died on the cross was to get punished because he himself became our sin. Hope was given on the cross. On the cross, and in all of Jesus' life, the law was fulfilled. The power and the wisdom of God were revealed. The good news was clarified. This is good news because you don't have to do anything to appease God. God loves you no matter where you are. And that's good news. Cancellation of the written code. The old code was nailed to the cross. A veil was removed. Veil of ignorance, maybe. The veil of understanding. But also the veil of the Old Testament law was removed and a new covenant was installed. That's what he talked about with his apostles the night before. This cup is the blood of the new covenant. And the final sacrifice was made. And God accepted it. And we know this, that God accepted his work, because we find that Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God. Nowhere in all of Scripture do you ever find angels sitting in the presence of God. They're either bowing or they're standing and they're doing something, but they're not sitting. And sitting reflects what is being done by a person who has accomplished their work. It is finished. The two great commandments that Jesus told us that were most important was to love God. It's kind of the vertical command. Love God with all your heart, soul, all of your mind, and all of your strength. And when tested by this expert, that's what Jesus said. Love God. It's the Shema. And then first love God, and then first love your neighbor as yourself. Love the people as yourself. And love the people because God loves the people. And love the people like we love God. We don't worship people, but we're supposed to love them and share and help and be kind. At any rate, those were the two greatest commandments that Jesus said, and it's very important in Christianity. And I realize the biggest obstacle of Christianity is actually it's people who say they're Christians. I hear this a lot. But still, this is the teaching of what Jesus had and the whole of the New Testament. Jesus taught in parables, and one of the great teachings about the Shema, or the teaching about love, was a parable found in Luke chapter 10, when a young lawyer stood and heard Jesus saying, love your neighbor as yourself. And the little lawyer stood up. I can just see this Jewish young man just getting fresh out of law school and saying, well, who is my neighbor, Jesus? And then Jesus proceeds to tell a story. It's what he often did. Jesus told stories about how the kingdom was coming into place, and how we as listeners and hearers of God's word either have really hard hearts and hard minds, and we're not letting his word stick in, or we have good, malleable minds that were receptive to his teaching, to his seed. But this lawyer says, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus said, well, your neighbor is this guy who helped a man. A man was robbed, and he laid on the side of the road between Jericho and Jerusalem, a known highway. They understood this illustration. There was a road, and they called it the robber's highway because he didn't go there alone. It was kind of a scary place to go. It was narrow, it was pretty treacherous, and the footing wasn't good, and sometimes people got beat up and hurt. And this guy was beat up and hurt, and a Levi came by and a priest came by, and they ignored him. Of course, they were Jews, and they didn't want to have to wash their hands and go get cleansed in the temple. People understood his parable because they kind of made sense. This probably wasn't based on a real event, but the parable was based on on things that the people understood at the time, teaching about farming and different religious scenarios and different business deals that were being made. Jesus communicated with his people with these stories that had a heavenly, they had an earthly story that everyone connected with and they could fully understand it, but it had a real spiritual meaning or a heavenly meaning. So it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. That's what parables are. And this man laying along this road that was dying, and then here came this Samaritan, a half-breed Jew, a guy from Samaria who Jews despise. They wouldn't even walk through Samaria. They wanted a really good Jew would avoid Samaria. But no, the Samaritan was the guy who was really nice. And he took this guy, took him and helped him. He put him up in a hotel, paid for his healing services, and paid for the doctor and the oil and came back and took care of the guy. And Jesus said that's who your neighbor is. And this was a real shocker to the people. Jesus knew how to shut people up with his parables. But he taught. He had about 40 different parables in the New Testament, as listed here, and that's the way he taught. He told stories. Jesus didn't preach to people like you hear people like me preaching. Turn to this chapter and do this. Jesus just stood back and told stories and loved on people. He certainly practiced what he preached, and Jesus never asked of us anything that he himself didn't do. When he said, go the extra mile, or when he says, turn the other cheek, or when Jesus says to love people and even love your enemy. Jesus practiced all those things. He knew what he was talking about. But that was the message. That's the message of the New Testament, and certainly of Jesus. It's a central figure. Is he the Christ? Well, what's the Christ? Some may ask. So let me help you understand. The Christ is a Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. So Christos is Christ. Messiah is Meshua. You may have heard. That's in Hebrew. Same thing. He's the anointed one. Jesus is the anointed one. And Christ is that term for the one that they were expecting, this guy from Jewish tradition, and that was going to be the suffering servant and be the Christ. But I'm not sure they understood that it was the suffering servant guy, but he was the Christ was going to be somebody who's going to be able to lead and maybe be a king. And I think they were real excited when they saw Jesus healing people and maybe raising them from the dead and then feeding them, feeding 5,000 people with just a few pieces of bread. Man, what a leader. Who wouldn't want that to be a good military leader? He provides all the food and he just walks out and said, hey, be healed, stand up, let's go fight again. What a great deal. But a lot of people questioned his healing. They questioned his goings-on of things. And they wondered if he was really the Christ. Matthew said 13 different times, yes, he is. And so in the New Testament writings, yes, they're claiming he is the Christ. And you can look these up. Jesus had some unique teachings about his own exclusivity, and his teaching about salvation in the New Testament. He said in Mark chapter 16, those who believe and are baptized will be saved. Teaching about redemption and righteousness. Teaching about sin and repentance. And he taught about faith. And we learn about grace in the New Testament. So there are some really unique teachings, very different than other religious groups that feel like you have to do something to get right with God. Here, Jesus did all the work for us to get right with God. We just have to accept it and believe it. Now, in the New Testament, there is some writing material that was important. Papyrus is what they wrote on. This is a plant of a papyrus along the Nile River. That's the only place in the world that really grew naturally and indigenous to that area. And what they would do, they would slice it like up and down, and they're kind of like cattails. If you've ever seen a cattail in a pond, you can slice them up and down and then open them up, and they have little layers in there, and you can lay them and press them on top of each other, and then you can make paper out of it. Well, you can imagine the paper wasn't all that good, but that's what they had, and they used that for 1,000 years. And then someone came along and said, hey, we can write paper, we can write on sheepskin or animal skin, goat skin. And so they did. Parchment is what it became, and vellum is just the high end of parchment. Parchment is just your regular stuff, quick make. But vellum is the high end, and then they would sew them together in pieces. A piece of parchment here was probably about this wide, right there. Those two columns are on one piece, and then they would sew them together with the next piece, and then so on. And it would take maybe a flock of 100 to get a really the full Tanakh onto a parchment. And here the favored writing material was vellum because it was taken a little more care. It was very finely prepared, and it was good animals, and it was lasted longer, and they'd put it in book form, and it was a codex. And then they could write it on both sides. They couldn't just, like in a scroll, they could only do it on one side. A codex then is on two sides and in a book form. It became our book. What is a canon? You may have heard of the canon of the New Testament. It's not a shooting up device. It's not shooting a picture or shooting a Xerox or anything else. Canon is a list, a rule of thumb, or a certain thing, a guide, maybe like a yardstick, that says this is what we use, a paradigm, if you will. And the New Testament canon is the list of 27 books that are in the New Testament today, and there are some other books that may be involved between the Old and New Testaments. They're called the Apocrypha, and then you've heard of other books, maybe Pseudegraphia, and those are added or extra books. But on this page we have most all the books of the New Testament canon were written in this time period in the 1st century. They were canonized by 300 or so, even mentioned as early as 150, and by Justin Martyr. Listed by Irenaeus by 185, and then by 367, everyone is listing it and recognizing that, yep, that's it. These are the 27 books. And you can look more into that, but pretty much the first 200 years they were just kind of sorting it out and trying to figure what book, and having a written list isn't confirming anyone for anyone. There was never a church council to confirm the New Testament books. What people were doing was just identifying and recognizing, oh, this is what other people are accepting. This is kind of the general acceptance of what people are reading. And they kind of weeded them out like that. There was no formal way of doing this. It just kind of happened. And in the end, this is what we have. And people recognized, yeah, by 300, Athanasius, about 367, he wrote a letter and said, yep, you can't take away and you can't add to. This is what we've accepted. And no one had a great meeting for that, but it's pretty much stayed the same ever since then. They've recognized some other letters are important, but they've never added them, and I doubt if that'll ever happen. But so that's what the canon is about. Fully accepted by Jerome around 400. I think 405 was when he finished the Latin Vulgate. Jerome did, and he was writing that and translating it from the original languages into Latin in Bethlehem in a cave. and but that's what he accepted. And he also put some of the Apocrypha in the Old Testament as well. Just a quick history of the New Testament storyline and timeline. Jesus was born around 4 BC. You can see this on page 421. Baptism, about 27. We don't have dates for this. You don't see that in the New Testament, but these are pretty close about where people think, it happened, but we don't know exactly. We weren't there. They didn't keep time, and time was in a different way than we keep time chronologically. They said, so and so was living here during the time of Tiberius was a king. And that doesn't really help. I mean, it gives you an idea of when Tiberius was a king and when this so and so lived, but that's kind of the way they said things, and it makes it challenging for people who want exact dates. We just don't have them. So, but we do get exact dates as we go along. As we get closer, people are a little bit more fine-tuned about dating in the 300s, and we understand we can work backwards with some things. But the first council, these are church councils. These were important in that they got together. In the first 300 years, there's a lot of discussion. What on earth is all this New Testament? Is this that? And they had some doctrinal discussions. And so they had a discussion about the divine nature of Jesus. And then about, what is that, 60 years later or so, well, we need to confirm this Nicene Creed that we put together. And that's right. Okay, we accept that. And then they had some other issues that they talked about. That wasn't the only thing. And then the third one that they come to is another 50 years later, it looked like. And they were, again, still talking about the Nicene Creed and the theology of Mary, the mother of Jesus. The question was, did Mary give birth to the mother of God? Or did Mary give birth just to, how are you going to term it? She gave birth to Jesus, but what do you call Jesus? And who do you call Mary? And a lot of people were saying Jesus. It was a discussion about Mary, and so anyway, the church councils over the years have gathered to clarify some different church doctrines, and that's what they were for. Here's the Nicene Creed. I'm not going to read it for you. I'll let you read it if you want to see what this says, and pause here and read. There are church splits. Because of doctrinal issues and other things, there's a split between the Eastern and Western Church over the papacy. Filioque, or something like that. That's probably Latin. But did the Spirit come from the Father, or did it come from the Father and the Son? How did that work? Oh, good grief. How many angels can you fit on the top of a pen? Who cares, right? People start asking really weird questions, and other people are just walking away shaking their heads. But it caused splits because it's really important to some people. And in 1054, the first major split of the church was between the Orthodox and the Catholic Church. And the Eastern Orthodox, the Greek, Russian, and other Orthodox churches, about 50 of them, split off over certain things in the church, over particular items. And they kind of went off and did their own thing, and they have their own governmental structure. And then later in the 16th century, there was a Reformation in the West over some of the same things. The papacy, the indulgences, which was money given to the church to lessen your stay in purgatory. This idea from the Catholic Church was that if you pay money, you don't have to go to hell, maybe, or purgatory, as they would term it. You don't stay there as long, and you can get out and get to heaven quicker. Well, some people would take that, I can just pay my way to heaven. Here's money. And then off they go and don't care. But then they had other issues about salvation, about faith, and about baptism. And when do you really get saved? Is it when you're baptized, or when you say you believe, or when you just think you believe? And so the questions go, and so the churches split. Here we are. Why are there so many church splits? As I've mentioned, it's over doctrinal issues. It's over leadership issues, the Pope, the elders. Should we have freedom to make our own decisions? Or do we have to lean on the Pope or someone else? And so on. That's where these church splits over the issues, and even modern day, there's a lot of church splits, and they're going on right now over the gay and the homosexual issues, about church government, over race or slavery. That happened during the Civil War. There's church splits over that. Church splits over music, and there are church splits over where can we have the coat hangers? What color carpet should we have? I want the building here. No, we should have the building of brick. No, we should have it of wood. And who cares? Again, but people get all fed up with things, and so they go. It's the nature of humans, really. So there are a lot of different denominations. Catholics have this. They have a couple or three, I think. Orthodox, there's about 50 or so across the world. Then Protestants. Of course, there's only one, really, they would say, there's only one Roman Catholic Church. And then the Protestants, there are hundreds of them, maybe thousands all across the world. And, my deal is that, well, yeah, there are a lot of splits, and who says that they all have to be Catholic? I would like to clarify this at this point, that the same thing happened in all religions. Buddhism had splits. Before Buddha had even died, there were splits. They were questioning, well, why can't women be priests? And then, or monks. And then in Islam, they had questions early on. The Shiites and the Sunnis. Well, should the leadership follow genealogically Muhammad, or should they follow doctrinally what he taught? Who's going to be the leader? Should it be literally his genetic code? Well, people split for all sorts of reasons, and it happens in all religious groups. So the Protestant Reformation, I just want to point out there's some people that are very important. Your book only mentions two of these, Martin Luther and John Calvin. I'm not going to mention them much here. John Wycliffe was very important because he was really the first guy that ever brought the Bible into English. He translated it into English by hand. The Catholic Church didn't like him. They dug up his body and threw it into the river after they burned him. So John Huss kind of followed and furthered John Wycliffe's works. And he lived in the Czech Republic, modern day area, not era. And then William Tyndale, he was a scholar, and in 2002 has been voted in the top 100 Britons. He was a great scholar and did a great deal of good for the English world. And he brought the Word of God into many people's hands, and he wanted every plowboy, which just basically means he wanted every simple person to have the opportunity to read God's Word in their own language. And so he spent his life work. He knew several languages and could speak. I think he could speak in 7 different languages, and he could translate from Latin, from Greek, and from Hebrew really readily. And he was great. And he was the first person to ever use the printing press for the English to be printing the English Bible. It was the Tyndale Bible. And then there's the Coverdale, and then there was the Great Bible, and then on it went. Finally, the King James, about 100 years later. But at any rate, Martin Luther was very important in all of this, and John Calvin kind of spread the mission of the Reformation even wider. So what's Christianity? It's a theological and practical applications based on their faith and teachings of Jesus Christ, his death, burial, and resurrection. And you can see some traditional and challenges of that on page 439 and see some comparisons there. And I'll let you do that. Then there's styles of music. That's one of the reasons why there's different denominations, and for all these different reasons, you can look at them. There's not any one style that's said to be certain in the New Testament. People have just taken the Bible and ran with it, and it's gone all over the place and done all sorts of weird things. People do weird stuff, can tell you that. But some people, take it to heart, take the teachings to heart, and I think that's the intent, of course, of any religion. Why are so many translations? Now, I think most scholars recognize about 99% of the New Testament we have is what was originally written. In what exact order, we don't know. There's no major doctrinal disagreements. In the 5,000 or plus Greek manuscripts that we have, they were originally written in Greek. There are no discrepancies. There's some challenges, but it doesn't change doctrine, and it certainly doesn't say anywhere that Mary died for our sins, and it doesn't say anywhere that Paul was crucified on the cross for the sins of all the people. No, it doesn't say that Judas died for our sins either. It all has the same storyline, every one of these, and they have most of the same exact wording, but they're misspelled. They leave out the word "the" here and there, and different things like that. So most of the Greek manuscripts that we have and what they've put together today is pretty much what was originally, even though we don't know exactly. We don't have original copies. They've been abused, used, probably thrown away. Early on, the New Testament was translated into 100 languages just in the first century. And we have copies of some of those and recognize when they were translated. Each language group wanted a copy. And so there were 20,000 manuscripts or more of the New Testament. By far more than any other religion and of the original copy stuff. And by far more than any other ancient document of anything we have in of the New Testament manuscripts. And in English, well, there are over 100 translations. There's probably 200, 300. I don't know. I haven't counted. I have a lot in my own office and in my library. And they all have a different reason for translating the way they do. They translate a little bit different. There's a cotton patch version that was meant for those who worked out in the cotton patch in the South in the 50s, in the 40s. And there's a pidgin version. It's a Hawaiian language. You can imagine that people want to know it in their heart language, they call it. The Phillips translation and so on. The NIV is the one I use because one of the guys that was on the translating committee was my professor as a student, and I learned from him Greek, and I learned from him how they did translation and why they did it the way they did. And I really respected his honesty and the way he did things. They have a heart for doing what they're wanting to do, but each translation, some go by words, some go by thoughts, some, the NIV was trying to weed out any unique English words that would make it sound British or Australian or American, and they really wanted a complete international English language for the NIV. So there's some different challenges with that, and just let everyone know there is no King James Version in Spanish. There's no King James Version in Mandarin, or because King James only authorized it in English. He didn't authorize it in any other language. Anyway, that's what we have for you here for this hour video. Sorry it's so long, but I covered everything I wanted to cover, and the book covers more. So do well on your summary.